5. That night passed quite peacefully as Draco wasn't actively trying to get Harry expelled, and Harry didn't see any particular reason to go and wonder about discovering what he already knew about the Philosopher's Stone. Of course, that might make it harder to explain to Ron and Hermione why he felt the need to go to the corridor on the 3rd floor that Dumbledore had mentioned involved dying a horrible, painful death. Then again, he wasn't even sure if he should involve them. Last time, he hadn't had any choice because he wasn't capable of getting through there alone, and his friends knew all about Voldemort and the stone anyway. This time, he was technically a legal adult, and dragging 2 11-year-old children along with him to face Voldemort seemed highly irresponsible. Come to think of it, considering that Quirrell had no chance in hell of getting the stone from the mirror, did he even need to bother going down there? But if he didn't, would Quirrell return to teach the next year? While any teacher, even a possessed one, would be better than the pompous Git Lockhart, having Voldemort at Hogwarts while his Horcrux was running around attacking people would probably be a very bad idea. He'd need to give this more thought. His musings were interrupted by the arrival of the Daily Post. More specifically, by the 2 broom-shaped packages that required 6 owls each to lift. One broom went to Harry at the Gryffindor table, the other to Draco at the Slytherin. Harry raised his broom at Malfoy in a cheers gesture, which the other boy returned. Harry quickly scanned the card. It's a good thing that Professor McGonagall warned me not to open this broomstick-shaped package at the table. After all, something that is shaped exactly in the form of a broom can be so many things, Harry muttered sarcastically. What, does she think I'm stupid or something? Or, more accurately, everyone else? Ron glanced over at the card to see what he was talking about. A Nimbus 2000. Ron moaned. I've never even touched one. Well, at least now I know what to get him for Christmas, Harry thought wryly. He wondered briefly why he hadn't thought to do so the first time around. Sure, first years couldn't have their own brooms at Hogwarts, but nobody actually listened to that anyway. And if Ron complained, as he was wont to do, about accepting charity, Harry could simply point to the Weasley sweater he hoped to receive. After all, Molly had sent it to him because Ron told her that he wasn't expecting any presents, and if that wasn't charity, what was? Not that he minded, he'd have done anything for some charity in his early years, particularly when he was still at the Dursleys. After breakfast, Harry headed back to the common room alone as Ron had chosen to stay behind and confront Malfoy about the blatant favoritism, which really meant that Ron wished that the school would buy him his own broom, and was cornered by Hermione. I suppose you think that this is a reward for breaking the rules. No, I think that this is a reward for me being ridiculously good at Quidditch. Harry paused. And because my parents were brutally murdered. You talk about that a lot, Hermione noted. Harry grinned. Yeah, so does everyone else. I'm just trying to keep up. I still can't believe that you were rewarded for risking your life. Harry nodded, his expression serious. I know. I mean, they were never going to expel me for something like that, but at the very least I should have lost some points and gotten a detention. I realize that what I did was reckless, but you have to understand that Draco, despite his inability to hold his broom the right way, knows what he's doing. I'm apparently a prodigy, although I had no way of knowing that at the time, but if I got hurt, it would have been my own fault and I would have taken responsibility for it. I guess what I don't really get is why it matters so much to you. Why? Because you could have gotten seriously injured. What more reason do I need? Hermione asked him. Harry laughed. Hermione, this is a magical school, and not a particularly safe one. People get grievously injured on an hourly basis. Horrible injuries are just something you're going to have to get used to, and I think you know this. So what's the real reason? What do you mean? I think this has more to do with the fact that we broke the rules and you seem to hold them as sacred, Harry theorized. Hermione reddened. I do not. It's just that rules are put into place for our protection, and as such we should follow them and not flaunt our disregard for them. That is true, Harry acknowledged. Sometimes, maybe even most times. But I won't follow pointless rules. If I feel that something has been put in place for my own protection, then yes, chances are I'll follow it. No promises, though. And I won't purposely endanger any fellow students. Occasionally, I may do something stupid like this. I probably shouldn't, but then again, I'm 11. Technically. You've got to cut me some slack. I suppose I can, if you really mean it about being more careful, Hermione agreed. So we're friends again. Friends? Hermione repeated, looking dazed. Great, Harry smiled, pretending not to realize why his use of the word friends had gotten to her so much, as her magic and her intellect had always made her a bit of an outcast and he could certainly sympathize, and proceeded to his dormitory. And was it strange that seeing his broomstick again had been just like seeing a long-dead friend again? The morning of Halloween, Harry received an unexpected letter. Well, the letter was unexpected because he never got mail, but the handwriting was downright shocking. Sirius. Quickly, Harry tore open the letter, wondering how in the world Sirius had managed to send him an owl from Azkaban. Unless, but no. He hadn't done anything drastic, like getting sorted into Slytherin, for Sirius to break out for, so how could the timeline have possibly been moved up? Dear Harry. I realize that you've probably never heard of me. Or, at least I hope you've never heard of me. If you have, it's all been pretty vile, I imagine, and you'll soon hear it at any rate. Most of it is a pack of vicious lies. Note my use of the word most because you'll have to remember that I was a teenager at one time. When you reach puberty, you'll understand. Anyway, I thought you'd like to know that I'm not actually a mass murderer. I am not nor have ever been a supporter of Voldemort, and I'm your godfather. Surprise! Here's to hoping that since I broke out during the year, they won't subject you to the horrors of Dementors. Sirius Black. Ex-con extraordinaire. Harry snorted. Typical. Bloody hell. Apparently, Sirius's escape had made the Daily Prophet again. Harry leaned over to Percy. Hey, when you're done with that, do you think I could borrow it? Certainly, Harry, Percy replied and, 20 minutes later, handed him the paper. Thanks, he said absently. Sirius's story was on the front page and it was by Rita Skeeter. This ought to be good. Black escapes Azkaban. By Rita Skeeter. Sirius Black is widely known to be the most infamous prisoner ever held in Azkaban. The question of why, however, has yet to be answered. Yes, Black killed 13 people with one curse. On the other hand, 12 of them were muggles, which even the most inept wizards can accomplish, and the 13th was one such inept wizard. Black's allegiance to He Who Must Not Be Named came as a great shock to many, and it is easy to see why. Black was certainly not a member of one of the most prominent dark families in Britain, after all, nor was he implicated in an attempted murder when he was 16. Despite the questionable nature of Black's reputation as infamous, given that Azkaban also houses noted prisoners as Black's cousin, Bellatrix Lestrange, who was convicted for, among other things, torturing Aurors Frank and Alice Longbottom into insanity and who took down 18 of the 24 Aurors sent to capture her, 3 facts remain. People are terrified of Black. No one has ever broken out of Azkaban. Black broke out of Azkaban. Despite its reputation as being impenetrable, perhaps there ought to have been a contingency plan in place. When questioned, Minister of Magic Cornelius Fudge had no comment but did insist that, we are doing all we can to recapture Black and we beg the magical community to remain calm. When pressed, Fudge admitted that they had not yet worked out a plan, although since Black escaped mere hours ago, a plan will likely soon emerge. In the weeks before Black's escape, he was known to mutter in his sleep about that greasy git and gotta go back to Mallorca. Who exactly is this greasy git and is Black actually heading to Spain? Only time will tell. Harry snorted. Rita Skeeter was really quite amusing when she wasn't hellbent on destroying his life. Still, he wished she hadn't thrown in that part about Neville's parents. He'd have to talk to Draco and see if he could convince him to get the other first years to lay off of Neville. The older years were generally too busy harassing each other to worry about them, so Neville wouldn't have to deal with much. Although really, what kind of 11-year-old taunted someone for having their parents tortured into insanity, especially when the taunters were actually related to the perpetrators? Harry arrived to Charms quite pleased. Draco, still shocked and thrilled that he, along with Harry, was the youngest Seeker in over a century, still felt immensely grateful to him and agreed not to mention Neville's parents and to stop the others from doing so. In fact, he'd even gone so far as to tell Harry not to do something stupid like going after Black when he was a fully trained wizard and psychotic killer while Harry was a first year, which was a far cry from the I'd want revenge if it were me of the first time around. The students were all whispering about Sirius when Harry arrived and some shot him curious looks, clearly aware of how Sirius and Harry's father were best friends. Harry briefly wondered why no one had said anything about Sirius supposedly betraying his family to Voldemort, but then he realized that that wasn't exactly common knowledge and, what's more, not technically a crime. Granted, it was morally reprehensible, but you really couldn't prove if someone was under a Fidelius charm nor who the secret keeper was. Additionally, Harry could safely assume that most secret keepers were more trustworthy than Wormtail, and so the only way they would betray someone would be through torture, and cracking under torture isn't exactly something one should be punished for. Once class started, Harry didn't bother practicing Wingardium Leviosa as he already knew it and instead divided his focus between helping Seamus with it and watching Ron and Hermione. When Hermione levitated her feather perfectly and got points and Ron started looking angry, Harry quickly levitated his feather over to Ron and began tickling him. Needless to say, Ron was very irritated with Harry by the end of class. Why in the world did you feel the need to torture me with that thing? Because I was bored and it amused me, Harry told him. And you got it so quickly. Like Hermione, but at least you didn't go rubbing everyone's face in it. It's not wonder no one can stand her. She's a nightmare, honestly. Harry groaned. Good God, Ron was obnoxious at that age. You just saw that she corrected your pronunciation. But you know, if she didn't, you never would have gotten it by the end of class. I guess. Ron admitted grudgingly. And I'd like to invoke the same rules I have concerning Draco where Hermione is concerned. Namely, no bad-mouthing my friends in front of me. After all, I don't let Draco say anything unless you're there to defend yourself. All right? Harry asked seriously. Fine. Ron sighed. Harry turned to look at Hermione and saw there were tears brimming in her eyes. Thank you, she mouthed. Harry just smiled. At the Halloween feast, Harry made sure to eat as quickly as he could in anticipation for the troll attack. He knew they'd continue the feast upstairs afterwards, but it somehow wasn't the same. Sure enough, 20 minutes into the feast, Professor Quirrell came sprinting into the hall and gasped out, "Troll, in the dungeons, thought you ought to know." What was his reason for being absent in the first place? Everyone else was there. And for that matter, how could he have explained why he was in the dungeons? And did he just leave the doors open and hope a troll would come wandering in? He'd never seen any in the Forbidden Forest. There was really no conceivable way this could have been an accident. Great going, Quirrell. Prefects, Dumbledore roared. Lead your houses back to the dormitories immediately. If Harry didn't know for a fact that the troll wouldn't really be there, he'd have pointed out that the Slytherin dormitories were in the dungeons. Although how to explain how he knew? So, Harry said brightly. I'm feeling reckless and thus I'm going to go looking for the troll. Who's with me? Everyone at the Gryffindor table looked at him like he was crazy. We're in, one of the Weasleys said. Percy looked aghast. Fred. I suppose I'll have to go to make sure you don't get yourself killed, Hermione sighed. Although for the record, this totally counts as endangering others. If she's going, I'm going, Ron said, eager to prove that he was just as good a friend as Hermione. Neville, who was also feeling reckless due to the article mentioning his parents, nodded that he was going. Percy looked longingly at the staff table. The teachers had already left to go to the dungeons. He turned to one of the other Gryffindor prefects and instructed them to get the Gryffindors back safely while he chased after his brothers and their friends. Harry, meanwhile, quickly left the Great Hall, the others hurrying behind him. He soon reached the girls' bathroom, taking care not to pass by Snape heading to stop Quirrell from getting past Fluffy, and stood outside of it. Excellent, my troll senses seem to be working, he beamed once he heard the troll inside. The Weasleys, Neville, and Hermione did not look nearly as excited. Are you sure this is a good idea, Harry? Ron asked, looking a bit green. Of course, Harry nodded. I mean, we're just a couple of schoolchildren about to face off against a full-grown mountain troll. What could possibly go wrong? And with that, Harry headed into the bathroom before the others had a chance to reply. I suggest we use Sectum Sempra, Harry said as the others followed him in. Except Ron and Neville, you guys do Wingardium Leviosa and drop his club on his head. Do you think I can do that? Ron asked. Positive, Harry grinned and fired the cutting curse at the troll. The troll's thick hide meant that it did not do nearly the amount of damage it would have done had the target been a human, but it still split its arm open. Behind him, the twins, Percy, and Hermione also cast Sectum Sempra and did quite a job distracting the troll. Good thing, too, as it was taking Ron and Neville a while to levitate the club and once he did, even longer to move it over the troll and drop it. Wow. George said. Keep this up, Dash. And we might actually dash. Admit we're related. Even Percy looked impressed. Well done, Ron. Ron's ears turned pink and he looked very pleased. Nice, Neville, Harry complimented. A sudden slamming and loud footsteps made them all look up. A moment later, Professor McGonagall, along with Snape and Quirrell, burst into the room. Quirrell took one look at the troll, let out a faint whimper and sat down, clutching his heart. Harry rolled his eyes at the Dada professor's theatrics. Snape bent down to examine the troll while Professor McGonagall glared at them, looking angrier than she had when she caught Harry and Draco playing Seeker. What on earth were you thinking of? Demanded McGonagall, with cold fury in her voice. You're lucky you weren't killed. After you guys left, I decided I wanted to go looking for the troll. I was upset after hearing that Sirius had broken out of prison. Mostly just because he didn't understand why it happened so early, but then, no one said he had to be specific. Neville was feeling the same way because of what the article had said about Bellatrix, but he wouldn't have done anything if I hadn't have gone, and he didn't want me to go alone, and the others went with me so as to stop me from getting killed. Percy did try to dissuade me, but once I left he had little choice but to follow me and had another prefect take the rest of the Gryffindors back. Harry was laying it on a little thick, but he didn't want to get the others in any trouble. Well, in that case. Professor McGonagall said, staring at the three of them. Potter, you foolish boy, how could you think of tackling a mountain troll on your own? Harry shrugged. I wasn't really thinking of that so much as how one of my father's closest friends could have been a Voldemort supporter and mass murderer. McGonagall looked away, no doubt thinking about the fact that said friend, although it was Peter, not Sirius, had also been Harry's family's secret keeper. Potter, 5 points will be taken from Gryffindor for this. I understand your frustration, but you should not take pointless risks like this. As for the rest of you, you each win Gryffindor 5 points. Now, if you're not hurt at all, you'd better head back to Gryffindor Tower. Students are finishing the feast in their houses. They hurried out of the bathroom and back to the tower. You do realize that you're insane, right, Harry? Hermione asked him. And that we got extremely lucky and by all right should be dead right now. Harry shrugged. Hey, I got us 25 points, why are you complaining? You're right, Ron said, coming up to stand by Hermione. He is mental. Harry smiled. There was nothing like a little near-death experience to help forge a friendship. The others hurried off to go get plates and Harry was about to join them when a thought struck him. He knew what had happened now, why things had changed. Sirius had also fallen through the veil. Chapter 6. As much as Harry wanted to find a way to contact Sirius, after all, he hadn't seen the man in 8 years and with Sirius, at least, he didn't have to pretend to be a near stranger, unlike everybody else he'd met again, he knew that he couldn't. Not yet. He wouldn't put it past Dumbledore to monitor his mail once he learned of Sirius's escape, not to be nosy or anything, but to keep Harry safe from what he thought was a huge threat. And at the Dursleys, where he had no one to monitor him 24/7, it would be even worse. No, Harry would have to wait until Sirius contacted him. The problem being, of course, that Sirius had no way of knowing that Harry knew all about what had really happened with Pettigrew and those muggles and the secret keeper switch. And yes, he would have to return to the Dursleys, at least this year. After all, he really had nowhere else to go, and Mrs. Weasley had the unfortunate habit of taking Dumbledore's word as law. Harry also couldn't just go up and capture Pettigrew now for a number of reasons, not least of all that he had never taken the time to learn how to cast the spell to reveal an animagus. As a first year, he really shouldn't know what an animagus was and, given his lack of contact with any of his father's old friends, had no way of knowing that Peter was a rat and even less cause to think it was Scabbers. If he took this up with an adult, they wouldn't believe him and Scabbers would probably move on to another wizarding family, knowing his cover was blown. No, as vexing as it was, he'd have to wait until he heard from Sirius again. Shortly after the incident on Halloween, which, of course, just invited more staring but did also have the unexpected side effect of convincing Fred and George that Percy wasn't a lost cause after all due to his part in their little escapade, was Harry's first Quidditch match. He wasn't really nervous as Draco Malfoy, though admittedly quite talented for an 11-year-old and the best Slytherin house had to offer, had nothing on him. He could fly circles around Ginny back when she was on a professional Quidditch team. Harry wished he had joined one instead of becoming an Auror straight away, but then again, it was right after the fall of Voldemort and he felt like he had a moral obligation to help round up all of his followers. Maybe this time, if he could end the war quicker or, if he was sufficiently brilliant lucky, prevent it from taking place at all. Then he could play all the professional Quidditch he wanted before he reached 30 or so and had to retire, to become an Auror. Come to think of it, becoming an Auror while in possession of the world's most powerful and death-attracting wand probably wasn't the best plan, was it? The game started off innocently enough. Draco and Harry flew around aimlessly, searching for the snitch. Harry hoped he'd be able to catch it before Quirrell thought to jinx his broom, but fate did not seem to be on his side. The second he did spot the snitch, Flint slammed into him and one of the twins shot a bludger at Draco. Naturally, in the confusion, the snitch disappeared. A few minutes later, to Harry's great annoyance, his broom started lurching. Harry groaned. He'd forgotten about that. Now, if he didn't do something quickly, Ron and Hermione would jump to conclusions about Snape and Harry really didn't want to set the precedent of blaming Snape every time anything went wrong. Not to mention he didn't want to have to actually start defending Snape until he absolutely had to, as he really didn't like his potions professor and so saying nice things about him made him nauseous. Petty, perhaps, but Snape was worse. The best thing to do would be to start a counter-curse and hope that his and Snape's combined efforts would be enough to stabilize the broom. Unfortunately, counter-curses to such things as bewitched brooms had been the sort of thing he'd resolved to look up later, and so that was out. He could take his chances that Snape could stop Quirrell, but he vaguely recalled Quirrell saying something about how he only needed a few more seconds to knock Harry off his broom when Hermione knocked him over. And come to think of it, why in the world would Quirrell try such a public and clearly not accidental method to kill him? Idiot. Well, if the two obvious answers were out, Harry might have to try something slightly unconventional. He saw the snitch down below him, to the left but heading his way. If he timed this just right. Harry stood up and jumped off his broom. There were gasps all around the stadium. It was clear that Harry had done this on purpose. As Harry fell through the air, he could only hope he'd reach the snitch before someone thought to do something to slow him down, like Dumbledore did that time Dementors crashed that Quidditch game he had against Hufflepuff in his third year. Which was another reason why Quirrell was an idiot. There was no way people would just let him fall to his death. Really, why did he even bother? Sure enough, Harry started to slow down. No. He was so close. Desperately, Harry twisted himself into a position to make him fall faster. Closer, closer, there. Harry's hand shot and grabbed the snitch. He chanced to look over at Snape, who rolled his eyes at the fact that Harry was obviously more concerned about winning than landing uninjured. He was the only one who seemed to have thought to slow Harry down, though, so Harry supposed he should be grateful. He was definitely going to do everything in his power to make sure that Snape survived Voldemort's second bid for power and didn't become one of the most hated wizards in Britain. Well, not any more than he already was among those who didn't appreciate his unique style of teaching. Seriously, didn't they have a seminar all potential teachers had to attend or something? Harry landed gently on his feet. That surprised him. He'd expected Snape to just let him fall when he was close enough to the ground to not get hurt. Then he remembered that Snape was rather bad at flying and figured he landed on his ass 1 or 2 times too many for him to do it to Harry. Triumphant, Harry held up the snitch. Within seconds, he was mobbed by the rest of his team. Good game, he managed to tell Draco as he was being dragged away to Hagrid's hut by Ron, Hermione, and, surprisingly, Neville. I really lucked out that the snitch just happened to be right in the path of my fall, huh? It was Snape, Ron declared, once at Hagrid's. Hermione and I saw him. He was cursing your broomstick, muttering, he wouldn't take his eyes off you. Rubbish, Hagrid insisted. What would Snape do something like that? Doesn't Snape do all that whenever we have potions? Neville asked. Harry laughed. Yeah, I do tend to provoke him a bit. At Hermione's look, he amended, okay, a LOT. But he's not going to try and kill me for it, and he definitely isn't stupid enough to try anything in front of the whole school. He'd probably try to poison me. But Harry, I know a jinx when I see one. I've read all about them. You've got to keep eye contact, and Snape wasn't blinking at all. I saw him. Hermione said urgently. Even if you ignore the fact that, as Neville pointed out, that kind of behavior is par for the course when Snape sees me, Snape was probably trying to stop me from falling off. I mean, he may not be a very good teacher, but is not so bad as to actively try to murder his students. Besides, he was the one to slow me down when I jumped off so I didn't break anything. Hermione crossed her arms. Okay, I'll bite. If it wasn't Snape, who was cursing your broom? Quirrell. Hermione's eyes bulged out. What? That's even less likely than it being Snape, Hagrid added helpfully. Ron just stared at Harry. Neville was the only one who thought to ask, why do you think that? I mean, Professor Snape is much scarier and evil-looking than Professor Quirrell. Exactly, Harry nodded. So if it's that obvious that he's evil to a bunch of first years, Dumbledore would have probably picked up on it. Harry paused. Dumbledore did have the slight tendency to be optimistic to the point of foolishness. Or at least Professor McGonagall. But wouldn't he have to trust Quirrell, too, since he's also a teacher? Hermione asked. Harry shook his head. Nah, it's Quirrell's first year. Plus, I talked to some of the older students and it turns out that there's some sort of curse on the position. Hermione looked skeptical. A curse on a job? Harry shrugged. Well, how else do you explain that nobody's lasted longer than a year for 40 years? Hermione didn't have an answer, so Harry went on. And it can't be Snape because his turban doesn't make my scar hurt. Hermione rolled her eyes like, oh god, not this again. But Snape doesn't wear a turban, Ron said, confused. Exactly. Quirrell does though, and I've learned that people in turbans are not to be trusted. How many people have you met who've worn turbans, Harry? Hermione asked him. Well, only the one, Harry admitted. But he just tried to kill me. And to answer your question, Neville, while we all know that Snape hated my father with a passion and seems to think I'm James Potter reincarnate, he hasn't once mentioned my mother. He's insulted me on everything else in my life but her, which seems strange. Do you have any idea why, Hagrid? Hagrid, who was looking more uneasy at the second at the thought of Hogwarts professors hired by Dumbledore out to kill Harry, brightened immediately. Oh yeah, they were great friends, your mum and Snape. At least till that fight at the end of their 6th year. Then why does he pick on you so much? Neville asked. Well, I look like my dad, right? Apparently I have my mother's eyes, though, and have you ever noticed he never makes eye contact with me? Besides, at this Harry grinned. It's not like I don't give as good as I get. The next month just flew by and Harry was surprised to wake up one day and realize that it was almost Christmas. He really needed to get a move on with those Christmas gifts. He also paid the Weasley twins 10 galleons apiece in order to have snowballs constantly following Quirrell around and bouncing off the back of his turban where Harry knew Voldemort was. They didn't want to accept that much money at first, but then Harry explained that by constantly he meant until the snow melts. They'd even managed to prevent the snow from melting inside and vanishing whenever any other teacher was nearby. Pure genius. One day, after potions ended, Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Neville, who still persisted to hang out with them, which Harry thought was odd, but then, he was used to a trio. Maybe it was time to get used to the idea of a quartet. Even Ginny hadn't managed to really join them once she and Harry had started dating, but then, Ginny had started trying in their 6th year not first, happened by Hagrid on their way to the Great Hall. Hi Hagrid, want any help? Ron asked, figuring it was the polite thing to do even if he wasn't exactly sure how to help. Nah, I'm all right, thanks Ron, Hagrid replied, realizing the same thing. Would you mind moving out of the way? Malfoy asked impatiently. Are you trying to earn some extra money, Weasley? Hoping to be a gamekeeper yourself when you leave Hogwarts, I suppose. That hut of Hagrid's must seem like a palace compared to what your family's used to. Harry met Neville's eye and they both moved forward to hold Ron back as he started to lunge at Draco. And just how would you know what Ron's house looks like? Harry asked. Are you some sort of stalker? Draco looked surprised. What? Of course not. I don't know, it kind of sounds like you are. What do you think, Ron? Harry hoped that by involving Ron in a verbal battle they could avoid a physical one. I think you're right, Ron agreed, still straining against them but starting to calm down. Besides, didn't we already have this discussion about how not everyone can be manor lords? Harry asked. Honestly, you'd think the scion of wealthy pure-blood families would have a better long-term memory. Oh, I know, Neville agreed. His short-term memory had improved dramatically since getting away from the pressure of being expected to live up to his parents' legacy by his well-meaning but misguided relatives and finding friends who didn't keep comparing him to them, and Harry had even gone out of his way to criticize the way his relatives had piled those unrealistic expectations on him his whole life. He was still scared of Professor Snape, however, who was at that very moment coming up behind Malfoy. What is the meaning of this? He asked silkily, eyeing the still struggling Ron. Nothing much, Harry said brightly. Just a friendly discussion on whether or not all the inbreeding affects one's memory. Then how do you explain Mr. Weasley? Well, Ron's a pureblood so he got kind of offended, Harry explained. Why wasn't Mr. Longbottom equally offended? Snape asked. Harry looked to Neville. I often wonder the same thing myself, Neville said, thinking quickly. Merlin knows I've had my share of memory problems over the years. He paused. Or at least I think I have. Snape looked to Malfoy, who remained quiet, not wanting to admit that he'd provoked them when they hadn't even responded properly, and so the potions professor just shook his head. Move along, all of you. I am going to kill him, Ron announced. Make sure you at least do it after he does something to deserve it, Hermione advised, knowing there was little sense in trying to reason with him when he was like this. And anyway, Neville, that was brilliant. He blushed. Thanks. On Christmas morning, Harry woke up to a larger stack of presents than he'd expected. Of course, it was still much smaller than he was used to, but he was fairly certain it was bigger than he had received his first year. Merry Christmas, Ron said sleepily as he stumbled over to his pile. You too, Harry replied, picking up the first present. All in all, it was a good haul. He got a wooden flute from Hagrid, a 50-pence piece from Aunt Petunia, which he gave to Ron, death threats from Uncle Vernon, no doubt for his parting words at the station, a Weasley sweater and fudge from Molly, chocolate frogs from Hermione, his father's invisibility cloak from Dumbledore, pranking 101 from the twins, a broom servicing kit from Draco, and a photo of his mum and dad, along with Frank and Alice, from Neville. Harry was especially happy with the last present. Yes, this was a much better haul than before. Harry looked up at the sound of Ron gasping. Harry, is this what I think it is? That depends, Harry grinned. On what exactly you think it is. A Nimbus 2000, Ron breathed. But Harry, I don't even. Don't worry about it, Harry told him. Your mother made me a sweater because you knew my relatives wouldn't bother, and I got you a broom so you can have an advantage when you're playing the twins because they are good. Ron looked torn between accepting the gift and bristling at what he still considered charity. Finally, his desire to have a top-of-the-line broom for once in his life won out. Thank you, he said quietly. Hey, what are friends for? Just then, the door flung open and Fred and George bounded in. Merry Christmas. Thanks for the book on becoming animagus. Most people just get us books on pranks dash. Which are nice dash. But you can't rely too much on those dash. As great pranksters must always be original. Harry smiled. Don't go rushing things and getting hurt, but see if you can manage it before you graduate. You're on, they agreed. In addition to Ron and the twins, Harry got thick woolly socks for Dumbledore, anonymously, of course, a book on herbology for Neville, hair care products for Draco. He really wished he had a camera to see the look on his face, although he clearly used something on his hair, Hogwarts a history for Hermione, so she wouldn't have to keep checking it out, a sickle for the Dursleys in return for the 50-pence, and the Monster Book of Monsters for Hagrid, since he already knew he would enjoy it. What's all that noise? Percy asked, sticking his head into the doorway. His brothers, who had been in the middle of discussing their sweaters, looked up at him. P for prefect. Get it on, Percy, come on, we're all wearing ours, even Harry got one, Fred said. I guess you didn't hear the real story behind the troll, huh? George added. I don't want dash, Percy protested as the twins forced the jumper over his head. And you're not sitting with the prefects today, either, said George. Christmas is a time for family. And with that, the five headed down to Christmas dinner. Strange, though, Percy didn't seem to be nearly as reluctant to spend time with them as he wanted them to think. Chapter 7. There weren't a lot of people staying for the holidays, but it was certainly more than had stayed during his second year. Harry elected to sit by a pretty blonde witch who looked like a 6th or 7th year. Hi, Harry greeted. Do you mind if we sit here? Watcher, Harry, she greeted. And no, I don't mind. Harry froze. She looked nothing like her, but her voice sounded so familiar and she had used her trademark greeting. Tonks, he asked uncertainly. She cocked her head at him. Do I know you? Not exactly, Harry admitted. But I took it upon myself to research my godfather's family members after he broke out of Azkaban. Family members? Fred asked, staring at Tonks. Godfather? Tonks repeated, staring at Harry. Harry nodded. Yep, my godfather is none other than one Sirius Black. You're his cousin, right? My mum is, Tonks explained. That's why I'm here. Given the sheer number of Azkaban inmates I'm related to, my mum has always had policy where every time one of my Death Eater relatives breaks out of Azkaban, I have to stay at Hogwarts where it's safe. Needless to say, this is the first time we've actually had to put this into practice. You're related to Sirius Black? Ron asked, stricken. Tonks eyed him critically. You're a Weasley, right? At Ron's nod, she continued, you are too, just not as closely related. Ron looked faint. Of course, you're not as closely related to Sirius as you are to Draco, Harry added, smirking. Ron groaned. What do you know about me? Harry asked, curious as to what the other houses made of him this time. Tonks snorted. Please, everyone knows you. But what do they say about me? Harry pressed. They say you have a death wish, Tonks responded cheerfully. Is it true that you went chasing after a full-grown troll because you were bored? Well, kind of, Harry said sheepishly. But if anyone asks, it was because I was so distraught that Sirius escaped that I wasn't thinking clearly. Personally, I think you're just nuts, Tonks offered. Harry nodded. That works, too. Just don't tell the prophet. I've got a good thing going here, being able to do or say whatever because everyone seems to idolize my forehead, and I wouldn't want anything to compromise that. I promise, Tonks laughed. So you're a 7th year? Percy asked. Yeah, Tonks confirmed. I'm a Hufflepuff. So you can tell me all about OWLS. Percy said excitedly. Here he goes again, Fred sighed. He does this whenever he talks to someone who's already taken them, George confided. The week we took OWLS was the worst week of my life, Tonks declared. The twins exchanged glances. You know, we could really use all the help we could get. George began. Tonks groaned. That girl was strange, Ron commented as they made their way back to the common room that evening. Yeah, she is, Harry agreed. But I like her. So do I. That was the most productive meal I've had in quite some time, Percy said happily. She looked like she was really regretting letting us sit down, Harry noticed. Why? Now Percy was confused. Some people don't enjoy discussing exams they took a year and a half ago at Christmas, Pierce, Fred told him. But you only let me ask her about them for 20 minutes, Percy protested. Because she was looking homicidal and we were feeling generous, George explained. What? Percy began. Ron tapped Harry on the shoulder. Hey, mate, can I talk to you for a second? Sure, Harry said surprised, and they headed up to their dormitory, ignoring the 3 older Weasley brothers' continued debate about the merits of rehashing exams. Ron stared at the ground, looking extremely uncomfortable. Listen, I know you must have spent a fortune on my present and I know I didn't get you anything. I'm sorry about that and I feel really bad, but I don't have any money. I know you're not the type to flaunt your wealth like Malfoy and some of the others, but it's pretty obvious that you have money. I couldn't afford to buy anything. Mum had to make the sweater and fudge she sent you and, well, what could I have possibly gotten someone like you? Poor Ron. It's not like Harry was trying to make him insecure, but he had been a little blasé about the ridiculous amount of fame and fortune he possessed, having been long used to it and used to Ron being long used to it, too. It made sense that he was a little overwhelmed. Harry put a hand on his best friend's shoulder. Ron, look at me. Ron did, reluctantly. You gave me your friendship when I had no one. The only other person I even knew was Hagrid, and he had to be nice to me. He was a representative of the school and knew my parents. You didn't have to be, and even though it took a bit, you remain one of the only people here who can see past my scar, and you have no idea how much that meant to me. It didn't seem like it. You've been nothing but confident since the moment I met you, Ron countered. Well, technically this was true, but really only because of Ron and Hermione the first time around. Ron, you saw what my relatives sent. Enough money to buy a small piece of candy and death threats. I've never had anyone until I met you, and that's more important than any broomstick. Do you mean it? Ron asked hopefully. Of course, Harry smiled. But I will be expecting something for my birthday. July 31st, write it down. Ron laughed and they headed back downstairs to play wizard's chess. Hey Ron, Harry shook him awake early that morning. Quite early, in fact, as it could barely even be called morning. Tap dancing spiders. Ron shouted as he shot up, knocking Harry to the floor. Huh? You're not a tap dancing spider. No, I'm not, Harry gritted his teeth. And what are you doing on the floor? Oh, nothing, I just wanted to know if you wanted to use my invisibility cloak to go find a magic mirror. Aren't most mirrors magical? Ron asked skeptically. This one shows you things you want, not lectures you about your appearance, Harry explained. Sure, why not, Ron said, rubbing his eyes as he headed for the door. Unfortunately, he misjudged the distance to the stairs and fell down all of them. Fortunately, the first-year dorms were the closest to the bottom. Watch your step, Harry called, a little late, as he grabbed his invisibility cloak and hurried to Ron's side. What was that? Sounded like a cannon. The Weasley twins appeared on the scene. Oh, it's just Ron. What are you guys doing? Professor Dumbledore finally got around to giving me my father's invisibility cloak back after he felt the need to borrow it for the last 10 years or so, and so Ron and I decided to go looking for this kick-ass mirror Dumbledore has around here, Harry explained. Wanna come? The twins stared at him incredulously. Do you even need Dash to ask? The twins tended to do the whole twin speak thing a long less around Harry, since he could actually tell them apart. Of course, he hadn't seen fit to mention that was because he cast silent identifier spells at them every time they entered the room, but hey. They were bloody identical and enjoyed confusing people. He was really just leveling the playing field. What's the meaning of this? Percy came down the stairs. It's long past curfew, and even though that doesn't technically apply to the common rooms, it's far too late to be up and about. You're not planning on sneaking off somewhere, are you? He asked suspiciously. Of course not, Fred assured him. Percy still looked skeptical. Harry is though, and he just invited us, George beamed. And may I just say that I am so proud. Ron, this one is definitely a keeper, Fred told him. You can't just dash, Percy began. It's the holidays, I don't have classes tomorrow, and there is nothing you can do short of hexing me that will stop me, Harry interrupted. I'll tell Professor McGonagall, Percy threatened. So I'll get a couple of detentions, that's not exactly enough to deter me. My relatives would be thrilled to hear I'm doing my utmost to get myself killed, and I honestly do not give a damn about house points. Really? Ron asked, wide-eyed. Really? You see, I've come to the conclusion that the house cup is really more of a suck-up cup. After all, the more of a teacher's pet you are, the more points you win. God knows I love Hermione, but she has got to be the biggest teacher's pet I have ever met, and guess what? She's the single biggest point winner in our year. I don't care as I lose Gryffindor all of our points because quite frankly I don't want to be a sycophant all year just so the Great Hall gets to be decorated in our colours for one meal and you get an entire train ride's worth of bragging rights. It's just not worth it, Harry concluded. Harry, my good friend, George began. You might be onto something, Fred finished. And by the time you'd find McGonagall, we'd be long gone. So how about it, Percy? Would you really stoop so low as to hex a first year? Harry challenged. No, Percy said, defeated. But I'm coming with you to make sure you don't do anything stupid. Percy paused. Well, anything stupider than this, he amended. Harry shrugged. The more the merrier. You're lost, aren't you? Ron asked as they walked past the same portrait for the third time. No, I'm not, Harry insisted. But we've been past here, Ron countered. I know what I'm doing. He's lost, Fred said. What the? George trailed off as a door appeared in front of them. That door wasn't there a minute ago, Percy said, peering intently at it. I know. It's a magic door, Harry explained. Come on, let's go. Harry opened the door and they all went in. In the center of the room was a huge mirror with an elaborate golden frame and standing on two clawed feet. The inscription read Erist stra eru uitub kafru uit onwosi. What the hell does that even mean? Ron asked. Harry shrugged. Beats me, I always figured it was some obscure language that only really old people with nothing better to do with their time understood. I know it's called the Mirror of Erist. There was a moment of silence and then Percy said slowly, I show not your face but your heart's desire. That's great Pierce Dash said Fred. But what does that have to do with Dash? The price of dragon's eggs Dash. In France? George asked. Percy rolled his eyes. It's obviously backwards. Obviously, Fred mimicked. Really? Harry asked, looking closer at the inscription. I show not you're right. That's amazing. It wasn't that hard, Percy said, but he looked pleased. So take a look, Harry invited. He looked in the mirror and saw Ginny holding a baby with messy black hair. Ron and Hermione stood next to her holding Teddy's hand. What do you see? Ron asked, hesitant to step in front of the mirror without knowing what to expect. My family, came the quiet answer. I see our own joke shop. George exclaimed. Sweet. I do, too. And I see Angeli, that's really a nice joke shop, said Fred, looking a little embarrassed. I see myself as the head boy and the Quidditch captain, Ron announced. Grand plans, Harry remarked. Can you even be the head boy and Quidditch captain at the same time? The twins looked mildly ill at the prospect of yet another head boy wannabe in their family and Percy looked thrilled at the thought of someone following in his footsteps. When Percy finally stepped in front of the mirror, he gasped. Minister of Magic? Fred asked. Probably, George agreed. Harry didn't think so, though. He sidled up to Percy and spoke quietly. You see your family accepting you. It wasn't a question. Percy looked startled. How did you dash? Not all dreams are impossible, Percy. Harry's life soon settled back into a monotonous routine, or as monotonous as anything ever was since Harry had decided on a devil-may-care approach to his second chance, until one Quidditch practice where Oliver would announce that Snape would be referring Gryffindor's next match against Hufflepuff. Harry had forgotten about that, but it wasn't really very big in the grand scheme of things. What did interest Harry was the fact that this would provide him with his first opportunity to approach Cedric since he arrived. Granted, reacquainting himself with Tonks, for he did make an effort to see her whenever he could, was a complete and total accident and a result of Sirius's decision to escape while Tonks was still at school, but he found he rather liked seeing her again after all these years. He hadn't been nearly as close to Cedric, but his death had a profound impact on him too. That certainly sounds like a bit of a conflict of interest, was Harry's only comment. You'd think they'd have a teacher who wasn't a head of house be the referee if they weren't going to use Madam Hooch. Of course, the why of the matter eluded him. Was this yet more evidence pointing towards Madam Hooch being a squib? Though Harry wasn't quite sure how much being up in the air with him would help Snape stop another attempt, especially as he'd need to actually pay attention to the going-ons for the other players. Shouldn't you be a little more concerned about the fact that he's going to blatantly cheat? Wood asked. Well, I would, but the referee can only do so much and the 150 points I get when I catch the snitch will definitely help on our way to the cup. And besides, since he's doing it for me, I'm kind of obligated to be a bit, dare I say it, grateful. Harry shuddered at the thought. Everyone stared at him. Harry, I don't quite think that Snape - George began. Is going to be blatantly biased towards Hufflepuff for your sake - Fred continued. Unless you have money on them or something, George ended. Harry rolled his eyes. Oh please. And he's doing it to make sure that Quirrell doesn't try to kill me again. That set off a whole new round of questions. When Harry had finally finished answering everyone's questions and changed, 4 to 5 minutes had elapsed. Honestly, it was like a bloody press conference, he reflected wryly as he headed to Gryffindor Tower to tell Ron and Hermione the news. He had just finished convincing Ron that his safety was, in fact, more important than a Quidditch game and he couldn't always jump off of his broom or else it would get old, when Neville showed up. Hey guys, he said cheerfully. You'll never guess who I just ran into. Who? Hermione asked. Malfoy. And you're happy about this? Ron couldn't believe it. Bloody hell, first Harry, now Neville, stay strong Hermione. Don't give in to his temptation. Hermione giggled. I'll try not to, Ron. So, what happened? Harry asked, for once the one to bring everybody back on topic. He vaguely remembered a conversation like this, but Neville had been much more upset. Oh, right. Well, I ran into him outside of the library and he said he'd been looking for someone to practice on, Neville explained. He shot a leglocker curse at me. And this makes him happy, Ron remarked. Either Neville's got some strange preferences or Malfoy's spell is stronger than I thought. Hermione ignored him. What did you do? Dodged it and ran like hell, Neville grinned. Nice, Harry approved. You should have hexed him back, Ron told him. No, he shouldn't have. Hermione said, scandalized. Would you have wanted to just stand there and face off by yourself against Malfoy and his 2 half-troll bodyguards? Neville asked rhetorically. Harry finally managed to place the situation. You're worth 12 of Malfoy, he echoed his words of 12 years prior. And don't you forget it. Chapter 8. The day before the match, Harry was flying around the Quidditch pitch idly when he saw Cedric Diggory on the ground, holding a broom and watching him. Spying on me? Harry asked as he landed. Cedric shook his head. Hardly. And I've already seen you play, remember? You go to matches you're not playing? Harry asked, surprised. Cedric stared at HM of course, it's helpful to see how the other team flies. Are you saying you don't? Harry shook his head ruefully. Well, I would, but I always get so frustrated whenever I spot the snitch and the seekers are oblivious. It's really not good for my blood pressure. You could always watch the other players, Cedric suggested. I could, but unless one team has scored 15 more goals than the other players don't matter all that much in the outcome of the match, so I never really see the point, Harry confided. Seeker bias, Cedric laughed. I completely understand. Good, Harry said, relieved. Everyone else thinks I'm crazy. From what I've heard, you are. We haven't been properly introduced, have we? I'm Cedric Diggory, he said, sticking his hand out. Harry Potter, Harry replied, shaking his hand. First Tonks, now you, does everyone here think I'm crazy? Pretty much, Cedric said cheerfully. That's not necessarily a bad thing, though. Hogwarts and the wizarding world in general have been stuck to the status quo for far too long and it's about time someone came and shook things up, even if I'm sure your motives are far less noble. So why are you out here then? Harry asked. Trying to get one more practice in before the match tomorrow. Sort of. This is my first year on the team and you're Harry Potter and insanely good at flying and don't mind jumping off your broom to catch the snitch and I'm just not sure that my sanity's damaged enough to let me pull the kind of stunts that you probably will to win. Nymphadora eventually got so tired of watching me pace that she kicked me out of the common room. Wow, Harry said, his eyes wide as saucers. What? Cedric asked. How did you get her to let you call him Nymphadora? I've been trying for weeks and I haven't had any luck. More like years, but no need to tell him that. Cedric laughed. She lost a bet last year. And before you get any ideas, she's vowed to never again let the use of her first name be a part of a bet. Because she lost once? Harry complained. That's not fair. Twice, actually. Charlie Weasley apparently won a bet with her 4 years ago and wanted the same thing. Damn. There goes that plan. The next day, Ron, Hermione, and Neville wished him luck outside of the locker rooms, clearly wondering whether he'd survive the match. Oh, relax guys. Not only is Snape not out to kill me and on hand to make sure nothing goes wrong, but given what happened last time, Professor Dumbledore will probably be here as well. I'll be fine, he assured them. You thought last time went fine, too, and you ended up jumping off of your broom, Neville pointed out. So? We won, Ron and Harry said at the same time. Hermione rolled her eyes. Just try and be careful, okay? I'm always careful, Harry assured her as he headed into the locker room. I was afraid he was going to say that. Hermione said, gazing worriedly after him. Unfortunately for Harry, he didn't find the snitch as easily as he had the last time he played this match. He supposed that made sense, finding the snitch in 5 minutes had been a rarity once, doing it again in the same match 12 years later, well, for him, anyway, was downright impossible. He looked over at the stands and saw Ron and Neville taking on Draco, Crabbe, and Goyle and briefly wondered what that was about. Oliver had only let 3 goals in while they had scored 8. At around 40 minutes into the game, he noticed the snitch hovering around his ear. Feeling slightly anticlimactic, he reached up and plucked it from the air. Game over. In the weeks that followed, Hermione had begun to obsess about the exams, which were still 2.5 months away. She had tried to get Ron, Neville, and Harry to follow the schedules she had drawn up for them, but even though Neville found her methods quite helpful, Harry had refused outright. Quite apart from his 12-year advantage placing him at the top of the class, no one ever actually failed first year, and given some of the older students at Hogwarts, that was really saying something. In fact, Harry didn't quite think that it was possible to fail until 5th year, and he had, in fact, not even taken the exams 4th year, so they couldn't be that important. Needless to say, Hermione was not pleased to hear this, but there was really nothing she could do to make Harry study, so she harped on Ron twice as hard. Still, his friends were constantly doing homework and everyone in the castle it seems was studying for exams, and so he spent far more time than he'd like to in the library. On one such afternoon, he was flipping idly through the pages of Quidditch Through the Ages when he heard Ron call out, "Hagrid! What are you doing in the library?" "Looking for a book to read," Harry suggested. "I mean, what else would he possibly be doing in here, hitting on Madam Pince?" "Just looking," Hagrid confirmed. "Unless I missed my guess, you just came from the dragon section," Harry said casually. "And don't even give me that look, guys. I'm spending more time in here than I am sleeping. I need something to occupy my time." "You could try studying," Hermione suggested, but Harry ignored her. "You wouldn't happen to be looking into raising a dragon, would you?" Harry asked innocently. "Wait, you don't actually have a dragon, do you?" Neville asked quietly. "I mean, that would explain why you're keeping all the windows shut and a fire going despite the fact that it's spring." "How would you know that?" "We haven't been down to see him in a couple of weeks," Ron pointed out. "Oh, well, I'm helping Professor Sprout out with the greenhouses and I always say hi to Hagrid while I'm down there. The past 4 days, though." Neville trailed off. "So are you?" "Maybe," Hagrid admitted. "Hasn't that been illegal for, 200 years? Harry asked. "Technically." "That settles it," Hermione said, putting her books in her bag. "We're going to go down and see this." Even though Ron didn't particularly want to go and stare at an egg in a virtual inferno, he was pretty excited to be doing something other than studying and he quickly gathered up everyone's things. "I can't believe it, I just can't believe it," Hermione was muttering as they followed Harry back up to the castle. How could he be so irresponsible? He lives in a small, wooden house and has no means for providing a safe and adequate environment for a baby dragon, not to mention their illegal dash. "Where are we going?" Ron interrupted her. "I don't know about you, but I'm going to go see Professor Dumbledore," Harry said. "You're going to tell him about Hagrid?" Neville asked. At Harry's nod, he continued, "But won't he get in trouble?" "He might," Harry admitted. "But Dumbledore's always been good at covering up things that go on at the school and I'm sure he can come up with a perfectly reasonable explanation as to why we have a baby dragon on our hands." "But Hagrid's counting on us," Ron protested. "True enough," Harry nodded. "On the other hand, Hagrid, as much as I love him, seems to be almost completely lacking common sense and I think we can all agree that the dragon has got to go. We're 4 11-year-olds, this really can't be our responsibility. The best thing to do in this situation is to turn it over to the responsible adults who should be taking care of this and that means going to Professor Dumbledore. Bertie Bott's every flavor beans." "Wow, first try," he remarked as the gargoyles guarding the headmaster's office sprung aside. "Harry?" Professor Dumbledore looked up, surprised, as his office was invaded by 4 first-year students. "Miss Granger, Mr. Weasley, Mr. Longbottom. What are you doing here?" Harry noticed that despite the fact that they'd never actually spoken in this timeline, mostly because first years didn't really have much cause for interacting with the infinitely important Albus Dumbledore but partly because he wasn't quite sure what to say to the man, even now, 7 years after his death. Or 5 years before, however you looked at it, Dumbledore used his first name. Interesting. Well, Professor Dumbledore, sir, Harry here wanted to see if you could, help with a problem we have, or discovered, really Hermione was clearly flustered to be speaking to the headmaster of Hogwarts and head of the Wizengamot for the first time. Harry decided to put her out of her misery. Hagrid found a dragon egg and he doesn't seem to understand that it's not legal or safe for him to raise it, especially at a school. We were hoping that, seeing as how we're 11 and you're a responsible adult, you'd take care of it. Dumbledore peered at him over the top of his half-moon spectacles. "You're certain of this?" Harry bit back a smart remark. He really would prefer to not have to deal with this personally, so he'd have to make a real effort to be respectful. "Yes, sir." "I see. Well, I must commend you for bringing this straight to me. Most students, I found, tend to take care of these sorts of things alone, which can end badly. 5 points to Gryffindor for each of you for your wisdom in getting a teacher involved." As soon as they were back in the hallway, Harry groaned. "Oh great, at this rate we'll never lose the house cup." "Most people wouldn't see this as a problem, Harry," Hermione told him, confused. "But I do because it's the suck-up cup, remember?" When Hermione shook her head, Harry continued, "Oh, right, you weren't there. Either way, I believe that the house cup is a school-wide conspiracy to try and spawn as many teachers' pets as they can and encourage teachers' pet-like behavior in everyone. Snape and I are doing all we can, but we can't lose Gryffindor the House Cup alone. Hermione just stared at him. You have problems. The exams were, of course, ridiculously easy. Flitwick wanted them to make a pineapple tap dance across a desk, and he made it tap not only across the desk but on the floor, up the wall, and on the ceiling, too. McGonagall wanted them to turn a mouse into a snuff box and, after complaining, as he always did, how inhumane it was to turn living creatures into inanimate objects, his was jewel-encrusted. Snape wanted them to brew a forgetfulness potion with no directions, and Harry did it with his eyes literally closed. Not to mention how he did on the written tests. Honestly, first-year end-of-the-year exams just weren't written for 23-year-olds, no matter how little they actually paid attention in class. The night the exams finished, the trio plus Neville, Harry had never really liked the term quartet, it always reminded him of an orchestra for some reason, were sitting in the common room, enjoying the fact that exams were over. Still, events being as they were, Harry would have to destroy the piece. So, Harry said casually. My Scar told me that Professor Dumbledore's in London right now and Quirrell is taking advantage of his absence to go after the Philosopher's Stone. What? Ron, who had been drifting off, sat up, suddenly wide awake. Philosopher's Stone. There's a Philosopher's Stone at Hogwarts. Hermione asked, her voice higher than usual. Well, yeah. I mean, what else do you think is in that one third-floor corridor we're forbidden to go to under pain of death? Harry asked rhetorically. Why would anyone hide something like that in a school full of children? Neville asked sensibly. Harry laughed. That is a damn good question. The fact remains that he did, though, and I get that I should have probably mentioned this before now, but I'm going after Quirrell and nothing you can do will stop me, so I was wondering whether you'd like to come with me or stay here and hope I don't get killed. 20 minutes later, after Hermione tried everything she could think of to convince him to stay or at least give a better reason for why he was going, the four of them were heading out the portrait hole. Where are you going? Percy demanded. Don't you know it's past curfew? Harry smiled pleasantly. Oh, I know. I just don't care. We are so going to get expelled for this, Hermione grumbled as they made their way towards the third-floor corridor. Oh, we will not, Harry disagreed. We're only breaking one little rule. I mean, we may die, but they can't possibly expel us because they're stupid enough to think putting dark wizard bait in a school full of children is a good idea. Honestly. Who's there? Peeves said, coming from around the corner. No, you're there, even if I can't see you. Are you a galley or ghosty or wee student beastie? Should call Filch, I should, if something's creeping around unseen. Hiya Peeves, Harry said brightly, pulling the invisibility cloak off of him but leaving it to cover the others. Party? Peeves asked. What are you doing? Causing mayhem, Harry said. I'm endangering myself and 3 other students by sneaking off to the third corridor. Is that irresponsible enough for you to let us go on our way? Peeves considered. This would be the corridor that Dumbledore said if you go near, you'll die. Yep, Harry confirmed. Well, all right, Peeves agreed. Got your conch, he shouted before zooming off. Ow. Harry said, rubbing his nose. Don't even laugh, guys. When they did reach the door to the third corridor, it was already open. Harry was surprised, they'd left an hour or so earlier than last time. How early did Quirrell leave? Oh well. Now guys, don't panic or anything, but there's a giant 3-headed dog in there, Harry said cheerfully. A what? Ron asked, clearly panicking. Oh, don't worry, Harry said. It also instantly falls asleep whenever it hears music and I brought the flute Hagrid got me. Harry entered the room, his friends reluctantly trailing behind. He played the flute and watched as first Neville, then Ron, finally Hermione jumped through the trapdoor. He then, still playing, jumped through himself, wondering idly how in the world they were going to get back up. Oh well, that wasn't his problem, that was Ron and Hermione's. By the time he landed, he discovered that Neville had already gotten rid of the devil's snare. Harry supposed it paid to have a genuine herbology prodigy with them this time. After all, having a plant try to kill you was highly embarrassing. They moved on to the next room where they found hundreds of flying keys and a few old broomsticks. Yeah, I'll deal with this, Harry said, taking his Nimbus 2000 out of his pocket and unshrinking it. Do you take that with you everywhere? Hermione asked him incredulously. Yep, Harry nodded. Boys, she muttered, giving him a disgusted look. Harry took off and, 2 minutes later, had grabbed the key and landed. He jammed it in the lock and completely ignored the awed silence behind him. So he was, quite possibly, the best flyer in Britain. He'd had years of practice, it wasn't all natural talent, not that they knew that. Then they reached the chessboard. Harry groaned. He hated chess. He was also incredibly bad at it, probably worse than an 11-year-old Ron, so there was really nothing to do but sit back and wait for the game to be over. When it was and Ron lay crumpled on the floor again, seriously, it's like Ron was masochistic or something, Hermione, Neville, and Harry hurried on to the next room, trying not to think too much about the blood pouring out of Ron's head. He was fine before, he'll be fine now, Harry tried to reassure himself. It wasn't very comforting. They walked through the room with the unconscious troll and continued to Snape's potions puzzle. The three of them read Snape's riddle, although, really, wouldn't it just make sense for Snape to simply tell Professor Dumbledore which bottle was which and then not let anyone else have any idea? And Hermione began walking up and down the aisle, tapping bottles and muttering to herself. Harry was pleased to note that he figured out which bottle was which a good 3 minutes before Hermione did. It really did pay to have dozen-year head start sometimes when dealing with someone as brilliant as Hermione. So, right. There might be enough for 2 of us to get through to face Quirrell, but definitely not for 3 of us. I'm going in, of course, and I'm guessing you won't let me go in alone, so I suggest rock, paper, scissors. After trying to explain to Neville how to play, Hermione chose scissors and Neville, not really grasping the concept, picked rock. Hermione, overthinking this as usual, decided that Neville wouldn't pick rock twice in a row and so picked scissors again. Unfortunately, Neville did indeed elect to go with rock and she was sent back to go deal with Ron and Dumbledore. Even though I won, Hermione gets the better deal, Neville grumbled. Oh, cheer up, it'll be fun, Harry told Neville, pouring half of the bottle into his hands. Fun? Fun? Facing down an evil teacher is your idea of fun? Yep, Harry nodded. Hermione's right, you do have problems. Harry beamed before downing the rest of the bottle. Chapter 9. Wait,